Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on a very specific and honestly a fascinating date highlighted in our source material, June 12, 2026. According to this deep dive analysis, that is the exact day a highly controversial SpaceX IPO crowns Elon Musk as the world's very first trillionaire. But, it begs the question, how on earth does someone actually amass $1 trillion? Is it just pure, unfiltered innovation, or is there a completely different underlying architecture at play here? Well, we're going to impartially unpack the source material's breakdown of modern megawealth. We'll look directly at the claims, the hard data, and those very specific financial maneuvers that the source argues actually built this historic fortune. Let's get into it.
Here is a quick look at our roadmap for today. 1. The trillion-dollar scale. 2. Selling the future. 3. Unfulfilled promises. 4. The billionaire tax playbook. 5. Politics and wealth. And finally, 6. The societal cost. All right, let's just jump right in.
Section 1. The trillion-dollar scale. Visualizing the unimaginable.
Okay, before we can even begin to understand the mechanics here, we really have to wrap our heads around the sheer magnitude of this number. $1 trillion. That's 12 zeros. It's almost literally unimaginable. But the source provides this completely staggering calculation to help us out. Imagine this. If you were handed $1 trillion and you went out and spent $1 million every single day, you wouldn't run out of money for more than 2,700 years. It's wild. We're talking about a level of wealth concentrated in the hands of a single individual that actually surpasses the GDP of most nations on Earth.
To break this down even further, the source uses this brilliant time metaphor because, let's face it, our brains just aren't really wired to process the massive leap from 1 million to 1 billion, let alone 1 trillion. Think about it this way. 1 million seconds ago, that was just about 11.5 days ago. Not too long, right? 1 billion seconds ago was roughly 32 years ago. But 1 trillion seconds? That takes us all the way back 31,000 years. As the source points out, 1 trillion seconds ago, human civilization hadn't even begun. Seriously, that is the unbelievable scale of the wealth we're analyzing today.
Section 2. Selling the future. Fundamentals versus hype.
So, how exactly does a company like SpaceX reach a $2.2 trillion valuation when it recorded a massive $5 billion loss in a single year? To explain this crazy discrepancy, the source points to economist Burton Malkiel's theories of stock valuation. First up is the firm foundation theory. Now, this is how we traditionally think the markets operate. In this model, a company's worth is firmly anchored in reality. It's strictly based on actual, tangible fundamentals. Things like how much revenue is coming in, what physical products are actually rolling off the line, and what the real profit margins look like.
But then, you contrast that with Malkiel's second theory, which is called castles in the air. According to our source material, this is the true engine driving this trillion-dollar wealth. In this scenario, share value totally detaches from physical reality. It depends entirely on psychological value, massive hype, and the grand promises being sold to the public. The source argues that investors aren't actually buying into current stable profits. Instead, they're buying into this powerful, almost cult-like vision of the future. And that is what causes the valuation to absolutely skyrocket, even when the company itself is losing billions of dollars.
Section 3. A history of unfulfilled promises, tracking the timeline.
If this massive wealth is really built on these castles in the air, what exactly are those castles? Well, the source tracks this fascinating decade-long pattern of immense technological promises. Back in 2013, the Hyperloop was promised as this incredible 600-mile-per-hour transport revolution, but by 2023, the company had actually wound down. Then in 2014, humans were supposed to go to Mars within 10 to 12 years, a timeline we've obviously passed in this 2026 scenario. In 2015, we were told fully autonomous Teslas would be on the roads in 3 years. And in 2017, the Boring Company promised to solve terrible city traffic with a massive network of underground tunnels, a project that the source notes largely failed to scale. The explainer's key takeaway here is that these immense, record-breaking stock valuations are historically driven by massive technological narratives that, as of the source's 2026 date, remain largely unrealized.
The source perfectly illustrates the financial skepticism surrounding all this with a really sharp quote from renowned investor Steve Eisman. You might know him as the guy famous for predicting the 2008 economic crisis. Looking directly at the fundamentals versus the sheer hype of the SpaceX IPO, Eisman called the valuation madness. He argued that investors are essentially buying into a science fiction narrative rather than any grounded financial reality. Basically, it's an IPO of a sci-fi story, tailor-made for a sci-fi cult.
Section 4. The billionaire tax playbook. Unlocking paper wealth.
Now you might be wondering, if 99.9% of this $1 trillion is just paper wealth locked up in company stock, how do the ultra-rich actually afford to live these incredibly lavish lifestyles without selling off and crashing their own market? Well, enter a brilliantly simple strategy the source calls buy, borrow, die. Here is the exact playbook billionaires reportedly use to legally dodge income and capital gains taxes. Step 1. Buy and hold. You basically never sell your shares because selling triggers a massive tax bill. Step 2. Borrow. So instead of taking a heavily taxed salary, you mortgage your shares to a bank in exchange for a massive, tax-free cash loan at a wonderfully low interest rate. And finally, step 3. Die. You hold those shares for your entire life, continually rolling over those loans, and then you pass that vastly appreciated wealth down to your heirs entirely tax-free under current U.S. rules.
To really anchor this concept, the source provides a highly specific, real-world example of Step 2 in action. Think back to the Twitter purchase. Musk didn't just sell off massive amounts of stock and pay regular taxes on that cash. No way. Instead, he mortgaged $62.5 billion worth of his Tesla shares to secure a $12.5 billion cash loan from the banks. So he gets the cash to spend, he gets to keep his shares, and he pays absolutely zero income tax on that borrowed money. It's kind of a genius loophole.
And the result of this playbook is honestly staggering. Between 2014 and 2018, Musk's wealth increased by $13.9 billion. Yet he paid only $455 million in taxes. That makes for an effective tax rate of just 3.2%. The source sharply contrasts this with your average working-class taxpayer, who generally pays anywhere from 20 to 30% in income tax. It's a really stark illustration of how the rules of the game just fundamentally change at the highest levels of wealth.
Section 5. Politics and Wealth. The Catalyst of Power.
All right, we are now moving into some of the most explosive claims from our source material. These are detailed allegations that this specific hyper-rapid accumulation of wealth was supercharged by deep political connections following the 2024 election. Impartially speaking, the source lays out a very specific timeline of alleged regulatory favors. They claim that following a massive $290 million donation to the Trump 2024 campaign, a series of unprecedented government actions took place. For example, the source alleges that the NASDAQ fast entry rule was suddenly altered specifically to push through the SpaceX IPO, bypassing the traditional waiting periods that are normally there to protect pension funds. They also claim the SEC waived crucial broker safety rules and that 40 different federal investigations into Musk's companies were just abruptly dropped. The underlying argument the source makes here is that amassing immense wealth isn't just about savvy business, it's heavily reliant on altering the entire political landscape to your advantage.
And the stakes of these alleged political maneuvers are absolutely massive. The source points out this specific, terrifying number, $70 billion. That is the amount of everyday, regular investors' money that the source claims was put at direct risk. Why? Because according to the source, just 2 days before that massive SpaceX IPO, the SEC waived the standard rule requiring brokers to keep customer funds safe in separate accounts. The source views this as an incredibly dangerous gamble of public money, all done to facilitate a single, historic $1 trillion IPO.
Section 6. The Societal Cost. Perspective on the Trillions.
So, zooming out from all the complex financial mechanics, what does this massive concentration of wealth actually mean for the world? The juxtaposition here is incredibly powerful. On one hand, you have a single individual whose net worth has just crossed $1 trillion. But meanwhile, the UN World Food Program estimates that it would require only $40 billion per year to completely eliminate world hunger by the year 2030. The source uses this hard data to emphasize a really tough reality. Ending global starvation would cost merely a fraction, literally just a tiny percentage of this one single person's net worth.
The source highlights this tension even further by recalling a very specific public exchange. You might remember when Musk challenged the UN to prove exactly how world hunger could be solved. Well, the UN World Food Program's director, David Beasley, actually responded with a literal, detailed roadmap. He showed exactly how 42 million people could be saved from starvation with just $6.6 billion. But despite the UN providing the exact, itemized plan that was requested, the source points out that the funds were never donated. It's a really stark reminder of the real-world choices and consequences that are inherent in these massive financial architectures.
Ultimately, history doesn't usually remember individuals simply for the size of their bank balance, right? It remembers what they did, and perhaps more importantly, what they didn't do with their power.
Looking at all of this, the hype, the complex tax strategies, and the alleged political maneuvering that built the world's first trillionaire, we are left to deeply consider one final thing. How will this era of unprecedented mega wealth ultimately be remembered? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.